From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
A voter uprising in Europe in elections for the European Parliament. Is it a harbinger of what will happen in the United States in November? Plus, the G7 leaders meet this week in Italy, but what does it say about Western democracy when the most popular leader is the Prime Minister of Italy? Welcome, I'm Paul Gigot, editor of the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal, and I'm here with my colleagues Bill McGurn and London-based Joe Sternberg. So elections in the European Parliament usually don't mean much, since that parliament doesn't have much power. Power still resides for the most part in the national governments. But this one was an exception, and the results are having repercussions in several countries, especially in France, where President Emmanuel Macron dissolved the National Assembly to hold new elections this month after his party took a drubbing to the conservative National Rally Party in the elections. But Joe, stepping in, it'll just focus on France, but sort of looking at the whole result. Gains by the right parties, losses for the left, and the center sort of did okay. What's the main message you took away from the voters?
So just to explain quickly to listeners exactly what's at stake here, we have Europeans across 27 member countries in the European Union voting for 720 members of the European Parliament, which is the bloc's top legislative body. And you're absolutely right, Paul, that historically voters have viewed this as an opportunity to send protest messages, although the parliament does have more power as time goes on and lawmakers are figuring out how to use it. So this is an important result. And this time around, voters seem to have been focused on two issues. And they were very focused on immigration, which has long been very controversial in Europe since former German Chancellor Angela Merkel basically opened the gates in 2015 to a large inflow of migrants from the Middle East and Africa. And then I think that another issue that voters were unhappy about is the mounting cost of net zero and climate policies in Europe. And remember, over the winter, we had farmers' protests against some of these measures in countries like Germany and the Netherlands. And now we've discovered that there's a bigger electoral majority behind that opposition to net zero. And so I think that voters have chosen to send messages on both of these by favoring parties of the center right and the insurgent or new right, who've always been very vocal on the immigration issue and the sort of cultural and social cohesion problems arising from that, and who also are most resistant to a bunch of the net zero policies.
Net zero being net zero carbon emissions, which is the target for the year 2050. And according to the Paris Climate Accord that was struck back in the Obama administration era. But to get there in 2015, countries are imposing policies in the interim that are designed to both subsidize alternative energy sources, wind and solar, biomass and such, and punish the use of fossil fuels. And that is leading to a lot of increased costs. Much higher electricity prices in many countries. And that has repercussions for Germany industry, for example, heavy industry, automakers. Bill, that's a real problem. And the Green Party in Germany really took a drubbing.
Yeah, I think part of the problem, you outlined it well, with these green policies and the European Union is that it's kind of become a religion among the international elite. That they have to push that no matter what the people want. And they kind of think the government can decree a goal like zero emissions and you just force people to get there and there's no cost. Well, the people are bearing the costs. They're very skeptical about that. And I think they're rejecting that in this. And that's similar to the U.S., where Joe Biden's green agenda is, I think, hurting him with ordinary people who don't like his EVs, are not sure that electric powered stuff is going to be as strong and reliable as something fueled by fossil fuels, especially in northern cold states. So that's a little similar there. They seem very out of touch with their publics. And I think this vote is just an example of that there's beginning to be a little bit of resistance there.
Joe, I want to elaborate on this question because remember the Yellow Vest movement from a few years back in France where the public revolted and descended on major cities, especially Paris, when Emmanuel Macron tried to impose a new tax that was on fossil fuels. And it was very nasty, and he had to backtrack. Macron had to backtrack. And this really set back his reform agenda for at least a year in France. Didn't they learn a lesson here?
You would have thought, but apparently sometimes you have to learn the lesson several times before you get it. I mean, I think the key thing that's going on here is look back 5 years to the last time that you had one of these elections. And 2019 was a very good year for Green parties who supported net zero. And I think that was because at that point, voters were really behind it. The thing that has changed since then is that people are becoming much more aware of the costs that will fall on households as a result of this. That's taken a bunch of forms. You're talking about fuel taxation, and particularly the fact that you're going to have to increase taxes on diesel fuel in particular, which is much more commonly used for cars over here than it is in the US. People are starting to see energy or electricity prices going up and wondering if the promise of cheap renewables is really going to be delivered. There have been controversies in a bunch of countries about home heating and whether people would need to convert to electric heat pumps as opposed to the natural gas-fired heating that they've been using. And then Europe technically is going to have phasing out internal combustion engine cars by 2035. That's only 11 years away now. And so people are starting to reckon with the cost of the transition to electric vehicles. And I think all of that coming together is changing the electoral balance on a lot of these issues.
And yet the elites don't want to listen, I guess. All right, we're going to take a break. And when we come back, Marine Le Pen's National Rally Party may get a chance at real power when we come back. Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot with the Wall Street Journal Potomac Watch podcast, and I'm here with Joe Sternberg and Bill McGurn. Bill, the National Rally Party, Marine Le Pen, the far-right, quote-unquote, leader, always described that way in the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Guardian and the Financial Times. But when you get 30% of the vote, is that a bunch of crazy right-wingers, or is, looming Nazis, or is something more going on behind them? What do Le Pen and her party represent these days?
Well, I think she's changed a lot, the party. No, I don't think it's quite the picture that's being painted of fascism on the march throughout France and everything taking over. She's been around a long time, is known for hostility to immigration, but she's kind of moderated a little bit on the euro, for example, and things. I would interpret her vote as a lot of people think that their government is not accountable to them. And it's a message that we want them to start being accountable and pay attention to the immigration issues that they care about. So it'll be interesting to see. She got a third of the vote. She also did a lot better than Macron's party and his coalition. And that, I think, is one of the problems that Europe's elites sometimes have in common with the U.S. The sense among the voters that the elites not only disagree with them on some fundamental policies, but that they disdain them and they don't like their values. And it's all this kind of mush coming out of it. And I think that's the consequences are what we're seeing now. As you say, it's mostly a protest vote. They have some power in the European Parliament, but not a lot. But it could be a harbinger of other elections down the line.
So, often the political trends across the Atlantic go in the same direction. I think back to the 1980s where Reagan was elected and then Thatcher, and then some other parties of the right. It happened with the New Democrats when Bill Clinton rose to power in the 90s, and then Tony Blair in the UK. Could this populism in Europe right now, Joe, be a portent of things to come in the U.S. this fall?
Well, in some ways, you can actually argue that the U.S. was the portent for what's happening in Europe, because I think that America's political system tends to be a bit more responsive to some of the discontents and frustrations that are driving a lot of these votes in Europe right now. And so if you want to look at a phenomenon like Donald Trump's win in 2016, I think that in that sense, the U.S. probably was ahead here. I think an interesting challenge in Europe now is actually, whether some of these parties and politicians run into the same problem that Donald Trump did during his term, which is that it's very difficult to translate that wave of popular discontent with the way things have been done or dissatisfaction with existing politicians or parties, translate that into functional governance. And I think you could probably find a bunch of conservatives or Trump voters in America who were happy about some things that he did during his term and very disappointed by his failure to do other things. And I think that's probably the next phenomenon that we might start seeing in Europe as this process plays out.
Let's look at France in particular. Emmanuel Macron's decided to dissolve the National Assembly. There's going to be a vote for it again here later this month. It's some risk, Bill, on Macron's part, because the assembly could follow the National Rally Party and become an obstacle in the 3 years remaining in his second presidential term. And Macron has, in many ways, a pretty good economic reform agenda. He wants to repair some of the stultifying labor laws, for example, that hold back France's economy and make its unemployment much higher than it should be. The National Rally, so I guess the gamble that Macron made was, look, they had this big protest vote for the European Parliament, which doesn't have big consequences for France, but I'm going to force the issue here in France, and I'm going to force French voters to confront what it would mean to elect the National Rally. And he thinks that if he does that, he can reclaim a majority in the assembly.
Yeah, I think you're missing one word. I agree with everything you said. I think he's calculating that now is a better time for him than to wait for this protest to gather steam. He might not be in as strong as position down the road. So he's calculating he's still strong enough now that he might be able to prevail. And he's not sure that in the future he would be in as good a position. So I don't know French politics well enough to say whether that's a good bet or not, but it's clearly his calculation. And we'll be interested to see if other governments follow. Because as you said, mostly a protest vote. The more interesting thing are elections coming up and whether it will translate into anything. I think it's fascinating for the reasons you said. One of the things about Marine Le Pen is immigration is still the top issue for her and so forth. But if you look, like I mentioned, Euro, and I think she now supports Ukraine. She supports supporting Ukraine, which distinguishes her from a lot of populists in the U.S. And so it's interesting. It says to me she wants to really be a player, not just be at outer edges of the legislature, but actually to form a government and get some things done.
Joe, is that right? The National Rally now supports Ukraine?
I think that their position does seem to be evolving, and it's certainly an issue that Le Pen doesn't talk a lot about. And it's notable that the other major figure in the European right now, which is Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni of the Brothers of Italy party, has become a pretty strong supporter of Ukraine since she and her party took power a couple of years ago. And so I think that signals that the European public is still more or less supportive of Ukraine, and that these parties are figuring out that they are going to have to mold themselves to that in order to be viable in some of these elections.